The world has been shocked, enthralled, and yes, even enamored with Ted Bundy for close to 50 years, but his full story is still hard to digest. Here's what you may not know about the All-American Killer. Ted Bundy was unsettling on many levels, and the way he behaved towards corpses made his crimes all the more disturbing. A self-confessed necrophile, he violated his victims before and sometimes days after killing them. When asked by psychologist Al Carlisle whether his necrophilia was a form of excitement, Bundy replied, "No, it is the possession of the person." Why his urge to possess people took such a ghastly form is anyone's guess, but neuroscientist Jack Pement had an intriguing idea. Based on recordings featured in Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes, Pement concluded that Bundy's acts were rooted in a desire for intimacy. Specifically, he suggested the killer was trying to recreate the closeness he lost after a traumatic breakup with girlfriend Diane Edwards. Bundy placed their relationship on a pedestal, idealizing Edwards' looks and the time they spent together. He later felt that a corpse could be anyone he wanted them to be. Bundy enjoyed watching his victims decompose. In some instances, he apparently shampooed their hair and painted their fingernails. Sometimes he kept their severed heads until he no longer wanted to be near them. Perhaps in some twisted, sadistic way, he viewed his victims as romantic partners who couldn't leave him. Before his long-delayed trip to the electric chair, Ted Bundy insisted his depravity had nothing to do with how he was raised. The Los Angeles Times reports that he claimed he was brought up in a normal home with two parents who loved him and painted a portrait of familial bliss devoid of the slightest vice. His relatives, however, told a drastically different story. In this alternate picture, Bundy's upbringing was filled with deception, chaos, and cruelty. For years, he was told his mother was his sister and that his grandparents were his parents, to conceal that he was born out of wedlock. The man he called Dad was vicious and unstable. As psychiatrist Dorothy Lewis described, Bundy's grandfather Samuel Cowell would kick dogs, swing cats by their tails, and beat people who angered him. He also argued with hallucinations. At age 3, Bundy would lay butcher knives beside his sleeping aunt. In the 2019 Netflix special Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes, a childhood friend recalled that Bundy was fond of setting traps in the woods.
They built a big pit in the ground and put sharpened stakes down in it, then covered the top of it up with vegetation.
Bundy's psychiatrist posited that he was mentally ill since infancy, which along with his horrific home life might help explain how he turned out. Growing up, Ted Bundy struggled with loneliness. According to psychologist Al Carlisle, as a kid, Bundy felt overshadowed by his step-siblings after his mother married Johnny Bundy. Though he later claimed on tape he had plenty of friends to keep him company, one of his actual childhood friends said Bundy was often picked on by the other kids.
He had a horrible speech impediment, so he was teased a lot.
Often feeling insignificant, Bundy retreated into his own mind, where he imagined being, quote, someone important. He listened to the radio and imitated the accents of politicians he heard. In high school, he was known to try to trick people. Perhaps tellingly, as a serial killer, he would sometimes attempt to trick women by mimicking a British or Canadian accent and pretending to be injured. As a teen, Bundy began peeping through women's windows. He didn't date in high school, and when he finally fell for someone, she dumped him for being dishonest and non-assertive.
He wasn't real masculine, and he wasn't tough, and if I got mad at him because he did something, he'd sort of be so apologetic about it.
Emotionally shattered, he coped by breaking the law. After a failed foray into politics and a failed stint at Temple University, he felt even lonelier and spiraled into violence. Obviously, loneliness didn't cause Bundy to kill, but it seems related, especially when you consider that he claimed that killing women made them a part of him forever. In Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth's Conversations with a Killer, Ted Bundy paints a picture of his high school years as lonely, isolated, and tainted by his inability to make friends. He felt as if his social development between junior high and high school had been inexplicably stunted, and he watched helplessly as his old friends grew and changed. He was painfully aware of his small frame, which impeded his ability to forge a path in sports. He was also bitter about the socioeconomic gaps between him and his peers, who lived in better houses. Most of all, he was confused that he couldn't grasp the new social constraints that high school presented. It was as if his social development peaked in junior high. However, Bundy's account doesn't completely jive with the memories of his classmates. According to author Anne Rule's The Stranger Beside Me, a former female classmate recalled that although Bundy was somewhat reserved, he had no trouble making friends or finding dates. People liked him and found him pleasing to the eye, and he would attend school dances. Even if he didn't personally participate in the student council or other in-crowd groups, he was friends with those who did. Once out of high school, Ted Bundy did some college hopping and enrolled at the University of Puget Sound before settling at the University of Washington. he elected to study Chinese, but that wouldn't last either. After falling in love with another student and getting his heart broken, Bundy seemed to have a shift in focus and changed his major to urban planning before ultimately settling on psychology. His record as a student was subpar, as he was forced to temporarily drop out because of bad grades. Maybe it had something to do with his unsavory extracurriculars. Some believe that his first murders occurred at this time, but his grades improved enough when he re-enrolled that he graduated with distinction, and even disappointed a psychology professor when he set his sights on attending law school in 1973. But Bundy would never end up graduating from the University of Puget Sound Law School. He began murdering more women, killing at least 7 in the early half of 1974, and was nearly arrested. He later studied law at the University of Utah, but by then the murders and disappearances were getting public attention, and it wouldn't take long before he was arrested for the first time in 1975. In 1978, the New York Times described Ted Bundy as an all-American boy on trial. A nation watched incredulously as the smartly dressed man stood accused of barbarically killing young women for years. It was utterly flummoxing for a public used to thinking that murderers were visibly different from the rest of society. Bundy didn't just look the part of the good guy, he sometimes acted it too. In the past, he reportedly ran down and subdued a purse snatcher and saved drowning children. He served as the assistant director of Seattle's Crime Prevention Advisory Commission and wrote a rape prevention pamphlet. While living and killing in Utah, Bundy became an active member of the Mormon Church and enrolled in law school. At first, much of the public viewed Bundy as the victim of overzealous prosecutors, crooked cops, and a vengeful fiancé. He used that perception to his advantage and turned court proceedings into sideshows built around his supposed squeaky cleanness. The fictional Hannibal Lecter is a cannibal who, much like Bundy, hides his savagery behind a likable facade. In fact, the character is partly based on Bundy. The books Red Dragon and The Silence of the Lambs, wherein Lecter helps detectives nab serial killers, were directly inspired by the interactions between Ted Bundy and Detective Robert Keppel. Bundy reached out to Keppel from prison in 1984 to offer assistance in catching the Green River Killer, a then faceless predator who killed almost 50 sex workers in Seattle. Bundy's theories about the killer were disturbingly accurate, and the killer was eventually identified as Gary Ridgway. Bundy knew Ridgway would keep returning to where he buried his victims and recommended a clever way to catch him. According to his 1995 book, The Riverman, Ted Bundy and I Hunt for the Green River Killer, Keppel suspected that Bundy's guesses about the Green River Killer were largely a projection of himself. However, Bundy also saw himself in Keppel because they were both, in his chilling words, hunters of humans. Ted Bundy's string of rapes and murders partly overlapped with a serious relationship in which he nearly married and tried to murder his girlfriend. That unlucky soul was Elizabeth Klepfer, also known as Liz Kendall, who dated Bundy for 6 years and later wrote the book The Phantom Prince: My Life with Ted Bundy. When they became acquainted in 1969, Kendall was a lonely single mother consumed by alcoholism. She had moved from Utah to Washington after divorcing a man she discovered was a convicted felon. Ironically, she introduced herself to Bundy at a bar in order to dodge a different creep.
And I went over and started talking to him. As a single mom, I never wanted to be bringing men home, but I was too drunk to drive, really.
Perhaps as the lonely son of a troubled unwed mother, Bundy felt at home with Kendall. He later claimed in a taped interview that he loved her in a destabilizing way. Each year, he celebrated the day they met by giving her a rose. He behaved like a father to her daughter. However, his warmth was interspersed with unpredictable coldness and fury. He even ripped up what would have been their marriage license because she worried about her old-fashioned parents seeing his belongings in her apartment. When evidence of Bundy's crimes mounted, an emotionally dependent Kendall remained in denial. While behind bars, Bundy told Kendall he fought the urge to murder her, but still once blocked a chimney in the hopes of killing her through smoke inhalation. Ted Bundy is an exceedingly grim example of how deceiving appearances can be. But even if you wanted to judge him by his cover, that cover changed so often that it's unclear who the authentic Bundy was, or if there was one at all. He constantly altered his hairstyle and changed the way he looked. His many transformations weren't just follicle deep. As forensic psychologist Dr. Catherine Ramsland explained, Bundy became whatever he thought he needed to be. He could go from showing deep devotion to callous indifference, and when he wanted to hide a crime, he seemed to sincerely believe his lie. Those who knew him on different levels have likened Bundy to a Kennedy, a cave-dwelling animal, and an ideal boyfriend. Maybe Bundy felt most comfortable being someone else. After all, his childhood was marked by deception, and he often fantasized about becoming other people. It's also possible that his transformations weren't always voluntary. Psychiatrist Dorothy Lewis, who assessed the killer before his death, suggested that Bundy suffered from dissociative identity disorder.
The basic humanity and the basic spirit that God gave me was intact, but unfortunately became overwhelmed at times.
No matter how good you are at hiding your true self, that mask is eventually bound to slip. Marilyn Chino saw it happen. She first saw the infamous killer at Seattle's Sandpiper Lounge in 1969. At the time, he didn't seem like a bad guy, Chino told KUTV.
I will never forget the look on his face. I can't describe it. It wasn't evil, but it was like he was staring.
Chino's best friend was Liz Kendall, and as Kendall and Bundy's relationship got serious, indications of his dangerous nature began to stand out. As Chino recalled, Kendall called her after discovering women's undergarments and plaster of Paris, which Bundy ostensibly used to make casts to fake injuries and abduct women. When women started vanishing and police released a sketch of the suspect, Chino and Kendall thought it was Bundy. Though they eventually alerted law enforcement, initially they backtracked when an officer they contacted misidentified the color of Bundy's car. That didn't mean they trusted Bundy, though. When he insisted on driving Chino home one night, she was petrified, calling the 30-minute ride the longest of her life. Decades later, she still questioned why he didn't kill her. Days before he died, Bundy divulged things to Detective Robert Keppel that no ear should ever hear. But occasionally, his confessions went in a surprising direction. According to transcripts of the recorded sessions, in 1974, Bundy did an about-face after luring a woman to his Volkswagen, saying, "I reached all the way to the car and this happened. Would happen sometimes. I just thought, no, I don't want to do it. I said, thank you, see you later," and she walked away. Was that remorse talking? It's doubtful. Even his acts of mercy had sinister underpinnings, which you can see in recollections dating all the way back to his childhood. When Bundy was a boy, he enjoyed buying mice from a pet shop. As his former defense attorney John Brown explained in his book, The Devil's Defender, he'd go to the woods and build a little corral, and then he'd decide which ones to kill and which ones to let go. It was Bundy's way of playing God. That's also how he viewed his human victims. For him, choosing not to kill was just another way to control life and death, which may also explain why Bundy once worked for a suicide crisis hotline. In 1971, Ann Rule was a 40-something-year-old mother of four whose marriage was on the rocks. Previously a police officer, she was trying to get by as a crime reporter. Once a week, she volunteered at a suicide crisis hotline, where she bonded with fellow hotline worker Bundy. Bundy opened up to Rule about his grandmother pretending to be his mother, and even discussed his love life. He likely wasn't a full-blown murderer back then, but had probably attempted to abduct women. You might think someone with Rule's police training would have spotted the monster behind Bundy's smile from a mile away. But as she would later write in The Stranger Beside Me, as far as his appeal for women, I can remember thinking that if I were younger and single, or if my daughters were older, this would be almost the perfect man. Rule would later be assigned to write about a series of murders that turned out to be Bundy's doing. When he was arrested, she held out hope for his innocence, but that hope faded when he broke out of jail and went on a killing spree. Even then, she remained his friend and became his biographer. When someone behaves as horrifically as Bundy, it's natural to want to know why. Pinpointing a clear-cut cause would suggest there's a clear-cut remedy. In 1989, Bundy placed the bulk of the onus on pornography and alcohol. Speaking with evangelist and psychologist James Dobson, Bundy said the sleazy imagery he saw at grocery stores served as a gateway to more violent material and ultimately violent behavior.
Pornography can reach out and snatch a kid out of any house today.
With that, Ted Bundy became the face of the anti-porn movement and was involved in multiple fundraising efforts for that cause. The common takeaway is that Bundy was himself affected by this type of imagery, or at least thought he was. However, there are reasons to be skeptical of Bundy's account. According to criminologist Dr. William Wilbanks, it's naive to believe that even Bundy understood the real reasons he did any of these things. Bundy's biological father hadn't been present from the start. Bundy was born at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers, and he knew just about nothing about his father, since a tight-lipped Eleanor Cowell only described the man as a sailor, as detailed in Ann Rule's The Stranger Beside Me. He did have a father figure in Sam Cowell, his grandfather, who again Bundy believed was his actual father. According to The Stranger Beside Me, Bundy decided to do his own digging once he was an adult. He looked up records at the Burlington, Vermont City Hall and found that his father was listed as Lloyd Marshall. Marshall supposedly attended Pennsylvania State University, had served in the Air Force, and had been employed as a salesman. Eleanor said she met Bundy's father through a friend while she was working as a clerk at an insurance company. In 1974, Bundy began working at the Washington State Department of Emergency Services, which had organized hunts for some of Bundy's missing victims, according to the only living witness, the true story of serial sex killer Ted Bundy. Bundy was popular in the office, his male coworkers admired him and were even envious. He raised interest among his female co-workers, to say the least, one of whom was Carol Boone, his future wife and mother of his only child. At the time, they were only close friends, as Boone's love life was a mess and Bundy was attached to Klepfer. But they would soon reunite, their bond stronger than ever. When Bundy was on trial, Boone was perhaps his biggest ally. She believed he was innocent and testified to his good character during the trial in 1979. They married in the courtroom while Bundy was on trial.
Will you marry me?
Yes.
And I do hereby marry you.
The romance ended when Bundy eventually admitted to his crimes, which shocked Boone. Ted Bundy's political career began when he was only in high school as a volunteer during a local election, according to the only living witness, the true story of serial sex killer Ted Bundy. The experience must have left an impression on him because he returned to politics in the form of Lieutenant Governor candidate Art Fletcher's driver and bodyguard. After he graduated from the University of Washington, Bundy worked as an aide for Washington Governor Daniel J. Evans' re-election campaign. It was here that Bundy engaged in some political machinations that would have made Richard Nixon proud. According to a report at the time by the New York Times, Bundy pretended he was a college student in order to infiltrate the campaign of Evans' opponent, Democrat Albert D. Rossellini. Bundy walked about the campaign with a tape recorder to capture Rossellini's answers to questions on issues. 1974 was a year of terror around Washington and Oregon, with a reported disappearance nearly every month, but July 14th of that year went down in infamy. That was when Bundy abducted 2 victims from the same location in broad daylight. The abductions happened at Lake Sammamish State Park in Washington. Bundy first convinced 23-year-old Janice Blackburn Ott to help him with a boat before leading her away, according to witnesses. Barely 4 hours later, Bundy returned and kidnapped another victim, 19-year-old Denise Naslund. Both were later found in a city adjacent to the park 2 months later.
There really are no clues, no theories as to the disappearance of the 2 girls.
Witnesses reported a man named Ted at the scene, identifiable by his MO, asking for help while wearing a sling. Police had descriptions of Bundy and descriptions of his car, but it still took over a year to hone in on Bundy. Bundy found various ways to get unwitting women to trust him and lead them into isolation. In addition to feigning injuries, he was known to impersonate a police officer, which itself is a crime, and this tactic would lead to his first arrest. It was November 8, 1974, when Bundy approached Carol DeRanche at a shopping mall in Murray, Utah. Posing as a cop, he told DeRanche that someone had tried to break into her car and requested that she ride with him to the Murray Police Department. She agreed, but as soon as he pulled over too soon and handcuffed her, she knew something was wrong. Quick on her feet, she managed to escape Bundy's car and hitched a ride to the police department to report Bundy. A description of Bundy and his car was now on file, and he would be identified a year later by a highway patrol trooper, leading to his overdue arrest. Bundy used other disguises to trick women. He would use crutches to appear vulnerable and then ask others for help. In fact, these were likely the same crutches that Bundy's girlfriend Liz Klepfer once spied in his apartment. Once in custody for the aggravated kidnapping of Carol DeRanche, police discovered Ted Bundy's connections to another crime, the murder of a nurse in Snowmass, Colorado. While being held at the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, Bundy was allowed access to the courthouse library since he was representing himself. No one seemed to fear that he would escape since they didn't bother to cuff his legs or arms. On June 7, 1977, when Bundy made his first jailhouse escape, jumping from a second-floor window while the guard was taking a break, Aspen went on high alert and schools closed down when news spread of Bundy's escape. Some even had fun with it, as local businesses began selling Bundy-themed shirts and burgers. Bundy was in custody again a week later. His second escape required more imagination. While in custody in Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Bundy lost about 20 pounds. He starved himself deliberately so he could fit through an opening in the ceiling that was supposed to hold a light fixture. He managed to escape through the ducting. This time, Bundy's freedom did not inspire jokes. He flew to Chicago and drove to Tallahassee, Florida, where he would murder his last 3 victims. Fears that Bundy would strike again and target more women after escaping prison a second time were justified. In the early hours of January 15, 1978, Bundy broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University with a wooden club. Wearing pantyhose over his face, Bundy snuck into the home and murdered 2 students, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman. 2 other students, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, were severely beaten.
Absolutely berserk. Absolutely berserk. But totally disorganized, totally unplanned, and things went wrong.
Sorority member Nita Neary managed to catch a good look at Bundy's face, and the resulting sketch helped investigators connect him to the incident. But that wasn't the end of Bundy's crime spree that night. Once he left the sorority house, he sought his next victims a few blocks away. Bundy climbed in through student Cheryl Thomas's kitchen window and physically assaulted her. Fortunately, her neighbor heard the commotion and saved her life. Bundy managed to escape, and 3 weeks later, he kidnapped and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach in Lake City, Florida, in what is believed to be his last attack. Bundy was placed on trial in June of 1979 for the murders he committed at the Chi Omega house, according to biography. The trial, which lasted almost a month, culminated in a guilty verdict. Bundy was sentenced to death twice, once for the murders of Bowman and Levy, and the second time for the murder of Leach. Later, Bundy would go on to be tried for other crimes, but it was ultimately the death sentence delivered to him in the FSU sorority house case which sealed his fate. According to ABC News, the survivors of the sorority house murders healed in the weeks and months following the attack, though the impact of their injuries and mental distress lasted for many more years. Kathy Kleiner shared that she struggled to come to terms with the deaths of her sorority sisters, and Cheryl Thomas, who was assaulted near the sorority house, deals with permanent deafness as a result of the attack. Ted Bundy is said to have had an IQ of 136, which would make him above average. Descriptions of Bundy follow a familiar pattern. He was a good student, but not an exceptional one. He was a B-plus student in high school, and he struggled with bad grades during his first stint in college, but still impressed professors. Bundy led his own defense at his murder trial, and he hadn't even graduated law school.
My class is graduating in about a month. In law school? I'll bet you I'm worried about law than any of them.
His performance as a lawyer impressed even the judge, who said that it was a shame Bundy was wasting his intelligence. But this isn't the complete picture of Bundy's smarts. Although he might have been charismatic as a lawyer, he would often put his own case at risk and cause onlookers to question his sanity. During cross-examination, he asked first responders to describe his crime scenes in detail, evidently because he enjoyed it, even though it did him no favors with the jury. He also wasted time making useless requests to the judge. Criminal justice expert Peter Vronsky suggested that advanced predatory instincts in serial killers are often mistaken for intelligence, which is likely the case with Bundy. One near victim's strange escape revealed Bundy's penchant for a certain type of female. Sotria Kritsonis was offered a ride by Bundy at a bus stop, and once she hopped in, he quickly made it clear she was not meant to make it out alive. He started yelling threats, but suddenly demanded that she take her hat off. It's well known that Bundy's preferred victim profile, at least in his murder spree of 1974, was a woman with long dark hair that is parted in the middle. Kritsonis may have fit that picture at one point, but had recently gotten a haircut. Bundy, who likely had been stalking her before, was surprised in her new hairstyle and dumped her off at her destination.
He could have killed me. It was just thank God I had gotten my hair cut, that I probably wouldn't be talking to you today.
Not everyone was so lucky. His first known survivor is Karen Sparks Epley, who was beaten and sexually assaulted by him in her bedroom in 1974 while she was a student at the University of Washington. She was attacked with a metal rod from her own bed frame and lay helpless for hours.
18 hours, 20 hours. My roommate Bob thought I was still sleeping.
Sparks was left with permanent injuries, including brain damage. There's arguably no car less threatening than the Volkswagen Beetle. Even from a design perspective, its rounded, curved features are nowhere close to being intimidating. But throw Ted Bundy behind the wheel of anything and it becomes exponentially scarier. And Bundy's Beetle was not just a means of transportation, he used it as a tool in his horrific crimes. Once an unwitting victim took his bait, he'd knock them out and push them into the car. The interior of Bundy's Volkswagen Beetle was heavily modified to suit his deranged needs. The passenger seat and the door handle were both removed, allowing Bundy a place to lay an unconscious victim out of sight with no means of escape should they wake up. It's believed that at least 11 of Bundy's victims met their unfortunate fate inside of one of history's most notorious cars. Considering the role Bundy's car played in his crimes, it's all the more fitting that it was a major contributor to his downfall and eventually his execution. Police pulled Bundy over in 1975 for driving without headlights. According to Scripps Howard Foundation Wire, police were immediately suspicious of the unusual modifications to the Beetle. They then found a series of items that would indicate to anyone that the person in possession of them was up to some kind of nefarious activities. Handcuffs, a ski mask, an ice pick, and pantyhose with eye holes cut out of them. Bundy was arrested at that time on suspicion of burglary. Soon out on bail, Bundy attempted to clean the car of all evidence related to his murder spree, and then sold the Beetle to teenagers in Utah. What eventually led to his downfall? 1 year earlier, Bundy had attempted to abduct Carol Duranche, but though Bundy had handcuffed her inside the Beetle, she escaped. Duranche picked Bundy from a police lineup, and the Beetle was then impounded by the police from the new owner. Forensic teams found damning evidence in the car, including blood and hair from 3 women Bundy killed. Bundy and Carol Boone weren't supposed to have conjugal visits while he was in prison, but they evidently happened anyway. In the documentary Conversations with a Killer that Ted Bundy tapes, Boone said that the prison guards were pretty lax about the rules, although the couple didn't have much privacy.
After the first day, they didn't care. Walked in a couple of times.
The result of these unions was Rose Bundy, Ted's only child. She was born on October 24, 1982. Her early childhood was peculiar, to say the least. Her father was on death row awaiting the electric chair, and she would pay him visits with her half-brother. The familial bliss, if you can call it that, came to an end when Boone divorced Bundy in 1986. When Bundy was executed in 1989, Rose wasn't even 7 years old yet. She has led a private life ever since. On the morning of January 24, 1989, the guards at Florida State Prison in Stark strapped Bundy to the electric chair. However, witnesses at his execution said he didn't appear to be nervous or afraid in the lead-up to the fatal moment.
His demeanor was puzzling to all of us as 40 witnesses in there, and I'm sure going through everybody's head in there is, why is he smiling at us?
His final words were spoken to his lawyer Jim Coleman and a Methodist minister named Fred Lawrence. He said, "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." The executioner pushed the button, and 2,000 volts of electricity did its work, per the Daily Beast. Outside the prison walls, a cheer went up from the 500-strong crowd. Ted Bundy was dead. After the autopsy, his body was cremated. His will stipulated that his ashes were to be scattered in the Cascade Mountains near where he grew up in Washington State. Bundy dumped several of his victims in these same mountains. There was a public outcry in Washington State following the news of Bundy's last request, but there were no laws prohibiting his family from scattering his ashes in the mountains, per another Associated Press report from the time. It's not known if his relatives actually scattered his ashes in the mountains. But that wasn't the end of the story. Following his execution and before his body was cremated, officials transported his body under guard to Shands Hospital in Gainesville, Florida. Medical experts, including the forensic anthropologist William Maples, removed Bundy's brain and examined it for any abnormalities. In The Riverman, Ted Bundy and I Hunt for the Green River Killer, Robert Keppel said Bundy's dark urges surged over him in chemical tidal waves like a craving for a narcotic. The thinking went that there must be an abnormality in the killer's brain that led to his aberrant behavior. Maples, when examining Ted Bundy's corpse, noticed the halo-shaped scorches on the killer's head and a deep burn on his leg from the electric chair. Bundy had been in good shape, apparently spending his time in prison working out, and had a self-tanner on his skin. When they removed the top of Bundy's head, they found a large mass of congealed blood on top of the brain, a side effect of having 2,000 volts course through his body. What Maples didn't find was anything out of the ordinary with the killer's brain. He wrote in his book, Dead Men Do Tell Tales, The Strange and Fascinating Cases of a Forensic Anthropologist, when it finally was removed and examined, Ted Bundy's brain looked like anyone else's. During his incarceration and after his death, Bundy had no shortage of admirers. Although some of them insisted he was innocent, others were keenly aware of what he did. However, they believed they somehow had the power to change him. As reported by Crime Viral, a vast majority of Bundy's fans only knew him through media reports and interviews. Therefore, they formed ideas about who he was without ever having met or interacted with him in person. Author Sheila Eisenberg has suggested many women who romanticized killers like Ted Bundy were abused in past relationships and have essentially been conditioned to seek difficult relationships. In addition to often denying the convicted killers were capable of committing the crimes, Eisenberg suggests they find the idea of being involved with an inmate and the challenges it presents to be exciting or thrilling.
Every time he turns around, I kind of get that feeling, oh no, gonna get me next,
But yet you're fascinated by him.
Very, very.
Some women view inmates like Bundy as a perfect boyfriend. Since they're behind bars, they can't leave the facility, are unlikely to have an opportunity to cheat, and are lonely or bored enough to maintain constant contact. Others are simply seeking the notoriety that comes with being linked to a famous killer. As reported by Crime Viral, some women contact killers like Bundy in the hopes of securing a book or movie deal. Although Ted Bundy was executed in 1989, several documentary films released around the 30th anniversary of his execution seem to have inspired an entirely new generation of admirers. As reported by MTV News, a startling number of teens and young adults have taken to social media sites, including TikTok, to express their interest and even admiration for the convicted serial killer. In some of the clips, the teens and young adults portray themselves as getting dressed and ready for a date with Bundy. Some videos include role-playing, with both women and men portraying Bundy's victims and the killer himself. MTV News reports one user attempted to convince her followers that she was Bundy's granddaughter. However, she later admitted it was a joke. It's unclear how many people involved in this rather disturbing trend are actual fans, or whether they're simply trying to increase their number of followers. Even to this day, we don't know how many people Bundy actually killed. He confessed to 28 murders over a mere 4-year time span from 1974 to 1978, but Robert Keppel, for one, suspects that he murdered hundreds of victims. The problem in narrowing it down comes from a few places. For one, Bundy seemingly enjoyed giving false confessions or otherwise misleading information to throw off the police. As Anne Rule wrote in The Stranger Beside Me, a scheme to send police out slopping through the mud in vain was something Ted would enjoy. There was also a lack of communication between different jurisdictions, particularly in the early days of the investigation.
I would call a police department and say, how many girls are you missing? We have one missing here, and I said, how many are missing in Seattle? I don't know.
Establishing a pattern was also initially difficult. Each one of Bundy's victims faced a different end. Thankfully, many of his known victims have been accounted for and received a proper final resting place. As Find a Grave lists, we know the precise burial locations and details for some of these women, but not others. Most of them, however, remain undiscovered. Despite eluding authorities for years, Bundy bungled many of his attempted murders. A handful of women are known to have escaped his clutches before he could kill them. These survivors have spoken to the media several times over the years, and even went on to live fairly long, healthy lives. But make no mistake, they're still victims who live with Bundy's horror every day. Survivors Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner were amongst a group of 4 individuals at Florida State University whom Bundy attacked on the same night, January 15, 1978. Karen and Kathy survived because car headlights passed through their room and scared the killer. He had beaten them with a piece of firewood. Similarly, survivor Cheryl Thomas spoke to ABC News in 2019 and described Bundy breaking into her apartment with pantyhose over his face and breaking her jaw. She was saved when neighbors in the same building called her phone and Bundy ran away. Carol Durange escaped Bundy by jumping out of his car and went on to testify against him as a teenager. His longtime girlfriend, Elizabeth Kleffer, meanwhile, stayed out of the limelight for decades, although she has since written about her experiences and has given multiple interviews about her time with Bundy. Sometimes Ted Bundy's victims were only partially recovered. As iNews explains, such was at least the case with Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, and Brenda Carroll Ball. All 3 of these young women were abducted from different locations from March to June 1974, when Bundy was most active, and in all these cases, only the skulls remained. Bundy placed them in the same location in Taylor Mountain, Oregon. Judging by Find a Grave, there is no information on these women's final resting places. Furthermore, the final resting place of Margaret Bowman, one of the 2 victims killed at Florida State University along with Lisa Levy, is unknown, although her body was presumably left intact. Like Bundy's final and youngest victim, Kimberly Leach, these 2 individuals were integral to getting Bundy convicted and on death row. As ABC News says, prosecutors used eyewitnesses and fibers to convict Bundy, along with a bite mark on Levy's body. Prosecutor Larry Simpson said that the bite mark was indicative of total homicidal rage. 7 of the known Ted Bundy victims are still missing, and because their remains haven't been recovered, these women are technically only suspected victims, regardless of the fact that he admitted to killing them. In the case of Lynette Culver and Donna Gail Manson, there are even missing person pages on the Charlie Project still available for information related to their cases. Cowboy State Daily says that Utah authorities recovered the patella of one missing person, Deborah Kent, which was identified in 2019 via DNA analysis. The rest of the body was never found. Cowboy State Daily also lists the potential locations of not only Kent, but Nancy Wilcox, Julie Cunningham, and Susan Curtis. Bundy himself provided the burial sites of these women, all near the Moab Desert in Utah, but authorities have been unable to locate the remains. Meanwhile, Find a Grave says that Georgianne Hawkins' remains were not only recovered, but accidentally cremated, along with unidentified persons. This looks like an erroneous claim, however, as the Charlie Project lists her as still missing. As for Denise Oliverson, Bundy claimed to have dumped her in the Colorado River. And in the case of Manson, Bundy claimed to have burned her skull in the fireplace. Out of all these missing women, only Wilcox and Kent have known memorial markers in a cemetery.